The prairie stretched wide in every direction, an endless ocean of grass rippling beneath the winds of the high frontier. Out there a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. For some, the emptiness was a curse. For others, it was freedom. For John McAllister, a rancher who had carved a life out of this wild land, it was both. John was no young gunslinger chasing glory, nor was he an outlaw running from justice. He was a working man, hardened by years of sun, dust, and toil. His cabin was small, built with his own hands from pine hauled down from the hills. The barn creaked in the night winds, sheltering a half-dozen cattle, 2 oxen, and his loyal horse, Whiskey. Most evenings, the only sound was the crackle of his fire and the lowing of cattle out in the pasture. He lived alone, not by chance, but by choice. The frontier was a dangerous place, and John had learned long ago that family could be taken away in a heartbeat. His wife had died of fever during their first winter out here, and their infant son soon after. The loneliness gnawed at him in the quiet hours, but he wore it like an old scar, painful but part of who he was. Every morning John rose before the sun. He would push open the warped cabin door, step out into the cool dawn, and take a deep breath of prairie air. His chores never ended, mending fences, branding calves, hauling water, or hunting game when supplies ran low. There was no one else to do it, and that suited him fine. Work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into memories. But the land did not always make life easy. That summer had been harsh, the rain stingy and the grass brittle underfoot. Coyotes prowled closer to the ranch than usual, and John had to keep his rifle handy at all times. He was used to hardship, yet every day reminded him how fragile his hold on survival truly was. And then there was the other threat, the one most settlers never stopped talking about: the tribes. To many ranchers, the native people were the shadow in the distance, the fear whispered around campfires. John had seen their riders before, dark figures on fast ponies watching from the ridges. But he had never traded words with them, never fired a shot. His land was his, their land was theirs, and as long as both sides respected that, there was peace. But the stories drifting from town, raids, ambushes, Barn set alight, made him keep an extra round in his rifle. Despite all of this, there was a certain rhythm to John's life, and in that rhythm he found a kind of quiet satisfaction. He enjoyed the smell of coffee at sunrise, the heavy feel of saddle leather beneath him as he rode the range, the satisfaction of repairing a fence post with nothing but sweat and grit. Each day might have been a struggle, but it was his struggle, and no man could take that away. The evenings were the loneliest. He would sit on the porch, pipe in hand, and watch the sun dip below the horizon. Sometimes coyotes would yip in the distance. Sometimes the sky would blaze red like a warning fire. Whiskey, his horse, would nicker from the barn, and John would answer with a quiet word as if speaking to an old friend. In truth, that horse was the closest thing he had to family. It was during one of those evenings that John's story truly began. He had been mending a wagon wheel in the fading light, his hands black with grease, when he thought he heard something strange, a sound out of place, softer than the wind but carrying a note of pain. At first he thought it might have been one of his cattle caught in the brush, but when he paused, listening hard, it came again, a faint whimper, human. John stood slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the line of trees near the creek. It was unusual for anyone to wander this far out. Most folks knew his ranch sat many miles from the nearest settlement. Wiping his hands on a rag, he set the wheel aside and reached for his rifle, more out of habit than intent. With careful steps he crossed the yard, boots crunching softly on the dry earth. The sound grew clearer. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't an outlaw lurking in the shadows. It was the thin, ragged cry of a child. John's heart kicked hard against his ribs. What business did a child have out here, half-starved and alone? Something wasn't right. He followed the sound until he found a small figure collapsed near the barn, hidden in the tall grass. The child was native, thin as a rail with hollow cheeks and eyes that fluttered open weakly as John knelt beside him. His clothes were tattered and his lips cracked from thirst. He looked no older than 10, yet his face bore the marks of hardship far beyond his years. John lowered the rifle and muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be damned." The boy tried to speak, but only managed a rasp. It was clear he hadn't eaten in days. For a long moment, John hesitated. He knew what this meant. Helping him could bring trouble, big trouble. If the boy's people found him here, they might think he'd taken the child captive. Settlers had been killed for less. But John wasn't the kind of man to leave a child to die no matter the risk. His heart remembered another boy, his own son, whose cries he hadn't been able to save. That memory alone sealed his decision. He slid his arms under the frail figure and carried him inside the barn. Whiskey stirred uneasily, as if sensing the strangeness of the moment. John set the boy down on a pile of hay and hurried back to the cabin. Within minutes, he returned with a wooden bowl of stew and a tin cup of water. "Easy now," John said gently, lifting the child's head. "Slow sips or it'll come right back up." The boy drank greedily, then winced as his stomach protested. John fed him by spoonfuls, patient as ever, until the bowl was empty. When the child's eyes closed again, John pulled an old blanket over him and sat back, staring into the shadows of the barn. A storm of thoughts raced through his mind. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And most dangerously, who might be looking for him right now? As the night deepened, John remained awake, listening to the wind and the steady breathing of the child. He didn't know it yet, but this single act of kindness would change his life forever. By morning, the prairie would not be silent. By morning, the rumble of 200 hooves would thunder across the land, and John McAllister would face the greatest test of his life. The night passed slow, broken by the restless noises of the prairie, the mournful call of an owl, the steady croak of frogs along the creek, and the sharp snap of wood as the fire in John McAllister's cabin died down to coals. But for John, sleep would not come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought of the boy lying in the barn loft, wrapped in a blanket. His stomach finally eased with food, but his body still weak. John had seen men broken by hunger before. Out on the frontier, when drought starved the grass and cattle dropped dead in the fields, whole families had wasted away. But never had he seen a child so close to death, alone in the wilderness with no kin to watch over him. The sight gnawed at him, stirring memories he had long buried, his own son lost years ago, whose fevered cries had faded into silence one winter's night. The boy was not his, and yet in the quiet hours before dawn, John felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had saved him from death's door. Now he would have to face whatever storm that act brought. At first light, John pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the cool air of morning. A pale mist hung over the pasture, and the world felt hushed as if holding its breath. He crossed the yard to the barn, boots crunching on the hard ground. Inside, the boy stirred when he heard John's footsteps. His dark eyes blinked open, filled with both fear and confusion. He tried to sit up, but his limbs trembled with weakness. "Easy," John said in a calm, steady voice, setting down a small tin plate with bread and dried venison. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to harm you." The boy hesitated, eyeing the food. Hunger won over fear, and he reached out with shaking hands, tearing at the bread and chewing quickly. John poured water into a tin cup and handed it over. The boy drank greedily until he had to stop for breath. John squatted down nearby, resting his elbows on his knees, studying the boy in silence. He was maybe 10, though hunger had made him smaller than his age. His face was sharp with bones, his hair long and tangled. His eyes were deep, watchful, as if they had already seen too much of the world. "What's your name, son?" John asked quietly. The boy froze. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he looked away, clutching the bread close to his chest. John sighed. "Don't matter if you can't tell me. I reckon you've been through a lot." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of jerky, laying it gently on the hay between them. "You eat and rest. That's all I'm asking of you." The boy gave the faintest nod, though his eyes still flicked nervously toward the barn door, as if expecting someone or something to come for him. For most of the morning, John let the boy be. He set about his chores, mending a section of fence and checking on his cattle, though his thoughts never strayed far from the barn. Each time he glanced over his shoulder, he half expected to see riders cresting the ridge, drawn by the presence of the child. By midday, John returned with more food. This time the boy seemed less afraid. He ate in silence, but when John offered him a small tin spoon, their hands brushed. The boy's skin was cold, his fingers bony. "You been out there long?" John asked gently. The boy's gaze met his for just a second, then dropped again. Still, he managed a small whisper, so faint John almost didn't catch it. 3 days. John frowned. 3 days without food or shelter? The boy nodded weakly. His voice cracked as he added, "I got lost." Something tightened in John's chest. Lost. Alone. A child wandering the wild prairie for 3 days. It was a miracle he'd survived it all. "Where's your people?" John pressed softly. The boy's lips trembled. He swallowed hard and whispered, "Gone." John felt the weight of that word. Gone. Whether they had been scattered, killed, or simply moved on, he didn't know. The child's eyes shone with unspoken grief, and John knew better than to pry further. He leaned back on his heels and rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Well, you ain't alone no more. You'll stay here till you're strong enough to walk. We'll figure the rest after." The boy's gaze lifted, cautious but grateful. For the first time, John saw a glimmer of trust there. As the afternoon wore on, the boy grew stronger. He managed to stand for a few minutes, though his legs wobbled like a newborn calf's. John helped him back onto the hay, careful not to push too hard. He had tended to sick cattle and wounded horses before, but tending to a child was something different entirely. That evening, John brought the boy into the cabin for warmth. He set him near the fire, wrapping another blanket around his shoulders. The boy sat quietly, staring at the flames, his face glowing in the light. "You remind me of someone," John murmured, half to himself. The boy glanced up, curious, but John didn't explain. Some memories were too painful to share. Instead, he busied himself with preparing stew, letting the scent of simmering meat and onions fill the room. When the meal was ready, they ate together in silence. The boy's small hands clutched the bowl tightly, as though afraid it might be taken away. John watched him with a mix of sorrow and relief. Afterward, John leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, and studied the boy again. "You know, son, out here on the frontier, folks gotta look out for each other. Don't matter the color of your skin or where you come from. A hungry stomach's the same for every man." The boy didn't answer, but his eyes softened. He pulled the blanket tighter and let out a long, weary breath. Before long, he had drifted into sleep, his head resting against the chair. John sat there a while longer, staring into the fire. Something told him this was only the beginning. A lone child didn't just appear out of nowhere, not in these wild lands. There would be questions and there would be consequences. As the flames crackled, John's mind wandered back to the warning stories he'd heard in town, about warriors who would ride hard to avenge even the smallest slight. If this boy belonged to a tribe, they would come looking. And if they found him here in a white man's cabin, what would they think? Still, John felt no regret. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he had done the right thing. No child deserved to starve in the dust. That night, as he carried the boy back to the loft and tucked him into the hay, John whispered quietly, "Rest easy, son. You're safe tonight." But outside, the prairie was already stirring. Far to the north, beneath the stars, riders were gathering. Hooves pounded the earth, and voices rose in the language of the plains. By the time dawn came again, the boy would not be the only visitor at John McAllister's ranch. John McAllister was a man who rose with the sun, but on that day he was already awake long before the first rays spilled across the prairie. His sleep had been shallow, broken by uneasy dreams and the weight of worry pressing heavy on his chest. Each creak of the cabin timbers and each rustle of the wind outside had made him glance toward the loft where the boy slept, wrapped in his blanket. It wasn't just the child's survival that troubled him. It was the question of what came next. Boys didn't wander the plains alone unless something terrible had happened. The child belonged to someone, maybe a family, maybe an entire tribe, and sooner or later, they'd come looking. John was pouring himself a tin cup of coffee when he heard it. A distant rumble, low and steady like thunder rolling in across the land. At first he thought it might be a storm moving in from the west. But the sky was clear, the horizon wide and open. He stepped outside, the screen door slapping shut behind him, and shaded his eyes against the rising sun. The sound grew louder. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath his boots. Then he saw it, dust rising on the far ridge, a wide brown cloud boiling upward against the blue morning sky. His stomach clenched. That wasn't thunder. That was hooves. John's eyes narrowed as he made out the shapes cutting through the dust. Riders. Dozens of them at first, then more as the line stretched across the ridge. Not a handful of scouts or a small hunting party. This was something larger, something meant to show strength. His gut told him the truth even before he could count them. Warriors. A war party. Lord Almighty, John muttered under his breath. 200 if there's one. His first thought was the boy. They had come for him. Whether they thought John had stolen him or harmed him, the sight of him here in a white man's barn would be all the excuse they needed to unleash hell. He didn't waste time. He strode back into the cabin, heart thudding against his ribs, and pulled his Winchester rifle from its rack. He checked the chamber, loaded extra rounds into his belt, and set his revolver on the table within easy reach. His mind raced through possibilities. He could try to run, saddle whiskey, ride hard south toward the canyon trails. But with 200 riders coming fast, he wouldn't make it half a mile before they cut him down. He could try to hide the boy, but they'd search the place from roof to floorboards. No, there was no escaping this. The only choice left was to stand his ground. From the loft, a small voice broke the silence. "They're coming," John turned sharply. The boy stood at the edge of the ladder, pale in the morning light, his blanket still draped over his shoulders. His dark eyes were wide, but not with surprise, with recognition. He had heard the thunder of hooves and knew exactly what it meant. "They're your people, ain't they?" John asked. The boy gave a small nod, his lips trembling. "My father, he will come." John's jaw tightened. "And what's he gonna think when he finds you here in my barn? He gonna thank me or cut me down where I stand?" The boy's gaze dropped to the floor. He had no answer. For a long moment, John said nothing. He just listened to the growing roar outside, the sound of 200 warriors drawing closer, the ground itself shaking under their charge. He had fought Comanche raiders once, years back, when he rode as a scout for the cavalry. He knew the look of a war party when he saw one. This was no small welcome committee. Finally, John set his rifle aside and crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes. His voice was firm but calm. "Listen to me, son. Whatever happens out there, you stay behind me. Don't run, don't cry out. Just stay close. You understand?" The boy swallowed hard and nodded. By the time John stepped outside again, the riders had crested the hill and were spilling down into the valley like a river of shadows. They rode painted ponies, their faces marked with streaks of red and black, their hair flying in the wind. Spears, bows, and rifles glinted in the morning sun. They came fast, circling wide around the ranch, their war cries echoing through the air until the sound filled every corner of the land. John's cattle bellowed in terror, stampeding against the far fence. The oxen in the corral pawed the ground, eyes rolling white. Even Whiskey stomped and snorted, pulling hard at his reins inside the barn. John stood in the middle of his yard, his rifle in hand, his boots planted firm in the dirt. He didn't raise the weapon, not yet. He wasn't foolish enough to think one man could fight 200 warriors. But he would not be seen cowering either. The riders slowed as they reached the ranch, surrounding the cabin and barn in a wide circle. Hooves kicked up clouds of dust that stung John's eyes. The air was thick with the smell of horses and sweat and the raw, electric tension of men ready for battle. At the head of the war party rode a tall man with broad shoulders, his chest bare but painted with bold streaks of red. A great feathered headdress crowned his head and his gaze was sharp as flint. He reined in his horse just a few yards from John, staring down at him in silence. Behind him, 200 warriors sat waiting, their bows drawn, their rifles ready. One word from their chief and John would be gone from this earth before he could take a breath. John's grip tightened on his Winchester. His throat felt dry, but his voice came out steady. "I don't mean you harm. The boy came here hungry. I gave him food and shelter. That's all." The chief's dark eyes flickered with something unreadable, but he didn't answer. He only raised his hand and the warriors fell silent, the earth itself seeming to hold its breath. John's pulse pounded in his ears. He had faced death before, but never like this. Never with 200 pairs of eyes fixed on him, judging whether he lived or died. Behind him, he heard movement. The boy had stepped out of the barn barefoot, still wrapped in the blanket John had given him. His small figure looked fragile against the sea of mounted warriors, but his voice, when it came, was strong enough to cut through the silence. "Father!" The chief's eyes widened. A murmur rippled through the warriors. The boy stumbled forward, clutching the blanket around his shoulders, and reached for the man on the great horse. The tension broke like a snapped rope. The riders shifted in their saddles, whispering to one another, their voices filled with disbelief. The boy had called the chief father. John lowered his rifle slightly, though his muscles stayed taut as bowstrings. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The boy he had nursed back from the edge of death was not just some lost child. He was the son of the chief, the very heart of this war party. And in that moment, John realized the danger he was in was matched only by the possibility of salvation. The boy clung to his father's leg, his small voice choked with tears. He helped me. He gave me food. He saved me. The chief's stern face softened just a fraction. His eyes shifted back to John. For a long, unbearable silence, neither man moved. Then slowly the chief dismounted. The air around John's ranch was so tense it felt as if even the wind had gone silent. 200 warriors sat mounted in a wide circle, their eyes fixed on the small patch of earth where John McAllister stood. At the center of it all, the chief had dismounted, his great feathered headdress swaying gently as he walked toward his son. The boy ran forward, throwing his thin arms around the man's waist, his voice breaking as he cried out in his native tongue. John didn't understand the words, but the sound alone was enough to twist at his chest. They were the sounds of reunion, of relief, of a child who had found the one person in the world he thought he had lost forever. The chief bent down, his large hands resting on the boy's shoulders. For a moment, the fierce mask of war slipped, replaced by something deeply human, a father's relief. He knelt, pulling the boy close, and murmured to him in low tones. The warriors around them shifted uneasily, their war paint stark against faces filled with surprise. John lowered his rifle, though he did not let it go completely. He was no fool. Relief or not, a war party was still a war party, and one wrong move could turn the dirt beneath his boots into his grave. The chief rose slowly, the boy still clutching at his side. His gaze turned back to John, sharp and unreadable. For several long heartbeats, the world seemed to hang between life and death. Finally, the boy spoke, his voice trembling but clear enough for John to understand. He helped me. He gave me food, saved me. The words hung heavy in the air. John felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes shift toward him, measuring the truth of the boy's statement against their own suspicions. The chief stepped forward until he stood only a few feet from John. He was a tall man, built like a warrior forged by years of battle, his chest painted with symbols of strength and vengeance. Yet his eyes, dark and sharp as a hawk's, held a depth of thought that went beyond simple anger. "You found my son?" the chief said, his voice deep, accented but clear enough in English to carry across the circle. "You gave him bread, why?" John swallowed, steadying his voice. "Because he was a child, because he was starving, and because no man with a heart leaves a boy to die." The chief studied him in silence, his expression like stone. Then he asked, "You knew the risk. You knew we would come. Still, you chose to help." John gave a small nod. "I knew, didn't matter. He needed me." A murmur rose among the warriors, their voices sharp, questioning. Some spoke angrily, pointing toward John, their hands gripping spears tighter. To them, he was still a white settler on stolen land, a man who had no right to claim trust so easily. The chief silenced them with a single raised hand. His gaze never left John's face. "Do you fear death?" John hesitated, then shook his head. "I've lived long enough with it riding my shoulder. Fear don't change a man's fate. If I die for helping that boy, then so be it. At least I'll die knowing I did right." The chief's eyes flickered with something, respect perhaps, or the faintest trace of admiration, but his face remained hard. He turned back to his son, who clung to his arm. The boy's eyes were wet with tears, his small voice pleading in his own tongue. The words were fast, urgent, but the meaning was clear. He was begging his father not to harm John. John stood still, his rifle lowered at his side. He could feel sweat running down the back of his neck despite the cool morning air. He had been in gunfights before, but nothing like this. Nothing where his fate hung on the words of a starving boy and the heart of a war chief. At last, the chief lifted his chin, his voice carrying across the circle. "This man saved the blood of our people. For that he has done what many of his kind would not. He has shown mercy when others show only cruelty." The warriors stirred, some nodding, others scowling. The chief raised his hand again for silence. To strike him down would bring shame upon us. To honor him brings strength. Then, in a voice that carried like thunder, he declared, "From this day forward, John McAllister is no enemy of our tribe. He is a brother bound by the blood of my son." The words rippled through the warriors like a shockwave. Some let out cries of approval, pounding their chests or raising their weapons to the sky. Others remained silent, their expressions cold. but none dared challenge the chief's decree. John stood frozen, hardly believing what he had heard. Brother. The chief had called him brother. What had started as a simple act of kindness to a starving child had shifted the course of his life in ways he could scarcely comprehend. The chief placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then stepped closer to John. They stood face to face, two men from worlds apart, bound together by one boy's survival. "You will not be harmed," the chief said firmly. "Your land will be safe. My warriors will not ride against you." His voice lowered, heavy with meaning. "You have earned something few men ever gain, the trust of my people. Do not waste it." John nodded slowly. "I won't." The boy looked up at John, his small face lit with gratitude. "You're my friend," he whispered. John managed the faintest smile. "And you're mine, son." For the first time since the war party had appeared, the tension began to ease. Warriors lowered their weapons, ponies snorted and pawed the earth, and the circle around the ranch began to break. Dust rose as the riders wheeled their horses, some casting long glances back at John before disappearing over the ridge. Soon, only the chief and his son remained. The boy hesitated, torn between the man who had saved him and the father who had come for him. At last he turned to John, clutching his hand one final time. "Thank you," he whispered. Then reluctantly he let go and mounted up behind his father. The chief looked at John one last time, his gaze steady. "We ride now. But remember this day, cowboy. Remember what it cost and what it gave." With that, he wheeled his horse, and together with his son, they rode off across the prairie, the feathers of his headdress streaming in the wind. John stood alone in the yard, his rifle hanging limp at his side, his barn and cabin still intact. The dust slowly settled, and the roar of hooves faded into silence. For the first time in years, John felt something stirred deep within him, something he thought had long since died. It was not just relief, it was belonging. A single act of compassion had turned strangers into allies, enemies into kin, and though the boy was gone, John knew he would never truly be alone again. The morning after the war party left, the ranch sat in silence so deep it felt almost unnatural. No thunder of hooves, no cries of warriors, no tension thick enough to choke a man's breath. Only the steady rustle of wind across the prairie and the soft lowing of cattle in the distance. John McAllister stood on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon where the riders had vanished the day before. He still half expected to see them return in force, but the land remained calm, empty but for the endless grass. It was hard to believe it had happened at all. That 200 warriors had surrounded his barn, that death had stared him in the face, and that he had walked away not only alive but with a word he never thought he'd hear: brother. He set the cup down and rubbed a hand over his weathered face. "Brother," he muttered to himself. "Never thought I'd live to see the day." The boy was gone now, riding with his father and people, yet his presence still lingered in every corner of the ranch. John could almost hear the child's small voice asking for bread, see his eyes shining in the firelight, feel the frail weight of him in his arms when he'd first carried him in from the grass. A bond had formed in those short days, something John hadn't felt since holding his own son years ago. The loss of that bond hurt, but it didn't leave him empty. It left him changed. For weeks after, John returned to his routine. He mended fences, hauled water, and rode the range with whiskey. But something was different now. Where once he had worked in silence, always glancing over his shoulder for danger, he now felt a watchful presence. The prairie was still wild and unforgiving, but it no longer felt hostile. He could sense eyes on him at times, warriors on distant ridges, shadows slipping through the grass, but they were not enemies anymore. One evening, while driving cattle back to the corral, John spotted a small shape on the horizon. A rider broke from the hills, fast and sure, closing the distance with the ease of someone who knew every contour of the land. John reached for his rifle out of habit but relaxed when he recognized the figure. It was the boy. He rode bareback on a small pony, his hair tied back neatly, his face no longer hollow with hunger. He looked stronger, steadier, his eyes bright with life. As he reined in near the corral, John felt his chest tighten with relief. "You came back," John said, smiling faintly. The boy nodded. "Father said I could visit." John crouched to meet him eye to eye. "You look better, stronger." "I eat now," the boy said proudly, tapping his chest. Then, softer, he added, Because of you. The words struck John harder than any bullet could have. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, gripping it gently. You're tougher than most men I know. Don't forget that. The boy smiled, and for a while he stayed with John, helping with chores, asking endless questions about the cattle, even laughing when Whiskey nudged him with a wet nose. For John, those hours felt like sunlight breaking through years of storm. When the boy finally left, he promised he'd return, and he did. Days later, then weeks later, sometimes bringing small gifts. A carved bone knife, a pouch of herbs, a feather tied with rawhide. In return, John shared bread, coffee, and the kind of stories only a cowboy could tell. Word must have spread quickly through the frontier towns, because before long, whispers reached John's ears. Settlers passing through spoke in hushed tones about the cowboy who'd been spared by a war party, who now rode under the protection of a great chief. Some didn't believe it. Others scoffed, saying it was luck. But those who knew the truth looked at John differently, with a mix of awe and suspicion. Yet it wasn't luck. It was trust, hard-earned through a single act of compassion. The real proof came one autumn evening when trouble rode in from the west. A gang of drifters, 6 men strong, came looking for easy plunder. They spotted John's ranch, its corral full of cattle, and decided it was ripe for taking. John saw them approach from the porch. They weren't the type to trade fair coin for beef. Their eyes were mean, their hands twitching near their pistols. He had faced outlaws before, but 6 men against 1 was a poor gamble. The leader sneered as he called out, "Evenin', old man. Fine herd you got there. Think we'll help ourselves." John didn't bother raising his rifle. He knew he wouldn't stand long in a gunfight that uneven. But before the drifters could move closer, the sound of hooves split the air. From the ridges, a dozen mounted warriors appeared, silent and swift as shadows. They rode down with spears and rifles at the ready, surrounding the outlaws in a heartbeat. The drifters' bravado crumbled in an instant. They cursed, dropped their guns, and fled into the prairie, too terrified to look back. The warriors didn't give chase. They simply sat their horses, watching until the dust of the outlaws' retreat faded. Then their leader turned to John, gave a single nod, and vanished with his men into the hills. John stood in the yard, stunned but smiling. The message was clear. The chief had kept his word. John's land was safe. From that day forward, no outlaw, no rustler, no hostile band dared touch McAllister's ranch. The cattle grew fat, the fences held strong, and John found a peace he hadn't known in years. He was no longer a lone cowboy scraping by on the edge of survival. He was something more, a man with allies, with protection, with a bond that tied him to the land in ways no deed or fence line ever could. Sometimes, when the boy visited, John would sit with him by the fire and tell him about his own son, about the family he had lost. The boy would listen quietly, his small hand resting in John's weathered one, and though neither spoke it aloud, both knew they had filled a space in each other's lives that grief had carved hollow. One night, as the fire crackled low, John looked at the boy and said, "Funny thing about this land, it'll break a man if he lets it. But sometimes if you're lucky, it gives you something back." The boy tilted his head, curious. "What did it give you?" John smiled softly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You, son. It gave me you." The boy didn't answer. He simply leaned against John's side, the way children do when words aren't enough. And so the days went on, the seasons turning as they always did. The prairie still stretched wide and wild. The danger still lurked beyond the horizon, but John McAllister was no longer alone. He had earned something greater than land, greater than cattle, greater even than survival. He had earned kinship. He had earned peace, and all because on one quiet evening, he had chosen not to walk away from a starving child.